Bob, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. Prime Talks is one of our charitable efforts because what happens is we introduce our families to extraordinary personalities and thinkers and thought leaders. And we ask our families to reciprocate by donating towards various mental health initiatives. And so the whole purpose of this exercise is to enrich their lives through getting the benefit of your insights, but also enriching the lives of others by contributing towards predominantly pediatric mental health, but really mental health at all levels and some of the initiatives that this program supports. So thank you for your help, and certainly for all of our listeners, please do support in helping us provide for more resilient families, more resilient individuals, more resilient minds, and more resilient communities by donating on the link in the description below the show. We greatly appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Wendy and Bob, for being here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Bob Patterson and Wendy Palmer Patterson. They are our guests on Prime Talks today. They are both extraordinary family and marriage therapists. They've been practicing together as a couple for over 40 years. Bob is a psychotherapist and licensed marriage and family therapist who facilitates men's groups through the Clearing for Men. And he also has specialized in management consulting and human resources. So through Imago Georgia's consulting services, Bob works with Fortune 500 companies as well as small businesses in the areas of communications, team building, conflict management, and organizational transitions. Wendy Palmer Patterson is also a licensed clinical social worker and marriage and family therapist. She holds a PhD in counseling with a specialization in Imago relationship therapy. Her focus is relationship consciousness, and she helps couples, individuals, and businesses build more intentional and fulfilling relationships. So I would love to hear what relationship consciousness means to you, Wendy, but more broadly, what is Imago therapy?
Great question. Well, let me say first, I don't think about Imago as a therapy as much anymore as more of a paradigm. Because part of what we've been uncovering, discovering, recommitting to is the idea that we're living in a different time where the paradigm of how we live needs to become the relationship paradigm, coming out of a long, long history of the individual paradigm. It's me, and a lot of focus on the me, which was important. As Harville would like to say, we went through the tribal paradigm and then the individual paradigm. Now it's everything we do affects everything else. So Imago is Latin for image, and it was a therapy initially that was based on the idea that you pick a partner in marriage or committed relationships unconsciously as well as consciously. And that means that they have a familiarity to you. And usually the familiarity was a familiarity, it's not a very pleasant one, painful, hurtful, sad, scary, and that you pick this person because they are going to help you grow and heal. And the idea that the committed relationship is the best possible place for healing and growth to happen. And so it's a structure, basically, but it's based on the idea that the between is what really matters. So we're trying to get rid of the idea of either or thinking and move to both and thinking, that there's always more than one truth. And so going from this kind of hierarchical to operating in a way that is more relational. And so it's really we were already very involved in working with families because we met way back in the 60s and 70s when there were lots of runaways, and the runaway kids were not the least bit interested in being the identified patient. Thought that their parents needed to change, while the parents thought they needed to change. So it was a time of already saying, we got to find some new ways to operate. So when Bob got us into the Imago work, it was a nice structure that fit well into how to help people move forward. And the idea about the structure is where consciousness lives. We talk a lot about brain functioning, and we tell all of our people about unconscious relating versus conscious relating. And significant difference is conscious relating. Intentions that you have match your impact. Unconscious relating, they don't. And if your intention didn't match your impact, you have a challenge.
Can you give us an example of that when you say intention meets your impact?
A personal one or
Yeah.
Something to
Those are the best guys.
understand that it's a great concept. Just could dive in there a little bit more deeply.
Well, one example would be, let's start with the personal side, is Wendy and I have had this, I guess, power struggle or disconnect around me sometimes instructing her to do something that she's already doing, right? So my intention is to help because I'm providing a good piece of advice or good instruction about how to do something. My impact is that it frustrates Wendy and makes her mad, and then the connection between us is broken. Both of us are sensitive to that, and we don't get the positive outcome that you want, because I was just trying to help.
It's a great example. So if it were conscious, he'd be saying, would you like some help? And then I'd get to say yes or no. If I said, like lately, we've gotten to the stages of our lives where he said to me about a year ago, I give you permission to help me with my driving. You can tell me what the street lights are coming and whether cars are coming, and I will not be insulted or, we'll be married 44 years this week, and that was a year ago. So it took us a while, but that was a very intentional thing that made then the impact such that I had full permission. So it's getting them matched. So many times, one of your pet things you'll hear in all family struggles is, you misunderstood me. That wasn't my intention. That isn't what I meant. I mean, and those are examples of where something came out of your mouth or out of your actions that was reactive instead of responsive. And when it's reactive instead of responsive, you're flipping your lid, you're causing the other person to then be reactive back, because reaction begets reaction. So the whole thing around the conscious relating is, you know what? We can do a different job about this. So I'd like to talk to you about something. Is this a good time? That's making a little mini contract about having an engagement. But if I just walk in the room when he's on the computer and say, hey, he looks at me, he's got not happy face. And I think the experience is I've interrupted him, didn't consider what he was doing, didn't bother to check. But I'm a busy person and I had to hurry. I mean, it's like all of a sudden we have a struggle that has nothing to do with content. It has to do with how we approached each other and how we treated each other. That's unconscious. Move it to conscious. Does that?
So, yeah, it makes sense. I just want to just go back to something else that you said. So what I heard you say is, and again, part of the Imago thinking is that there is an embedded tension, right, in the fact that who you attract will, by definition, attract attention, so to speak. I mean, actually, it's quite biblical. There is a concept in Hebrew in the Bible called Eza Connecta, which means you attract your opposite, so to speak. But the question is, what are the limits of that? Okay, how does one know when the extent of that tension is constructive and healthy, and when that tension is actually toxic and destructive?
You know that when that tension is dysfunctional. We all know that. We can tell that this is not going well. And so what we're looking for there is a perspective on growth, trying to come out of that conflict. When you apply skills and intention to that situation and it doesn't work, then you just got a tough decision to make, right? The contract that we make early on is, like when he was saying, is non-conscious, right? We don't have to work at it. Wendy and I didn't have to sit down and talk about our attraction or anything like that. It just happens, right? So, and this happens in families as well. We are constantly designing these contracts, but we're not talking about it. We're just kind of moving it in. You can think about who does what at the home, right? And did you guys sit down at a table and talk about that? Who's going to take out the trash? Who cleans out did you talk about all that? Or did it just kind of fall into place? And usually that stuff falls into place. And it does for a reason, because maybe, one of us is better at this or that, or has more attraction to it, or whatever it is. So when the tension, or what we call the frustration, we joke about it. We say, if you are frustrated with your partner or a family member, then things are going the way they should go, right? Things are unfolding the way they should, because without that frustration and without that dysfunction, there would be no growth, right? Wendy and I have this other thing about optimism versus pessimism. Right? Wendy sees herself as the optimistic one, and I see myself as the realistic one. Wendy doesn't see me as the realistic one. She sees me as the pessimistic one, right? And we've gone back and forth about that for years, right? And we're not careful, we miss the growth opportunity in that for both of us. We did this funny thing where I told her that I was going to work on this, and I would come to her every day for 30 days. And I was going to say something positive to her about life and how things were going great and all that. And so I came in on day one, I said, business is good. And I came in on day two, the children are doing well. We live in a nice neighborhood. We live in a great house. After about 4 or 5 days, I asked her if I could repeat. Or come up with something new every day, right? And so what I touched there was that, of all the blessings I have in my life, I wasn't focusing on them. I wasn't bringing them into conscious, expressing gratitude about it when I have this great life, right? So it really helped me turn toward opening up to a growth area. I grew up out west in Albuquerque in cowboy country, and it was just guys were supposed to not have feelings and not express them, and certainly not express any kind of vulnerability. So that was the contract. I mean, you can see that it was a deal that is made that needs to be retired at some point. It's like a jacket or a coat that you bought when you were in your 20s, and now you're in your 50s, and it just doesn't fit anymore.
We talk about it as there was a reason for the original,
right?
But there's also a season, and you outgrow. So the tension from our framework is growth trying to happen. All conflict is growth trying to happen. So it is easy for it to be toxic, Mo. It often is toxic because people don't have a concept of what's unfolding. I mean, if you look at a family structure, for example, if you look at teenagers and just say, what on earth happens to a teenager that turns them into someone who is so incredibly hard to be around? And if you think about that, they didn't used to be. So that tension is something's trying to happen. We think the struggle, if you don't change the struggle, you will have a lot of pain. And this is where divorce happens. This is where cutoffs happen. So when if you think about relational paradigm, that change is trying to take place. And wouldn't it be amazing and good if you could join that impulse and see how you could do the both and of it? But, we make a living out of people's toxic tension. But it's also the beauty of being able to say, you don't have to live like this. You can change the contract and need to change the contract. And often we're looking too at how it even comes generationally. I'm doing what my grandmother did and what her mother did. And there were all these good reasons back then. Do you know the story about the one good family story is that mother's teaching daughter how to cook a roast, and she has her cut off the bone part of the roast. And the daughter says, finally, in our era, well, why do you do that? She said, well, that's how you get it makes it more flavorful. Why does cutting that off work? I don't know. It's what my mother did. Go to mother. Why do you do it? It's what my mother did. Go to grandmother, who says, I never had a pan big enough to fit the roast. I mean, it's that kind of thinking that, again, that what he learned about how to be in the world, what I learned about how to be in the world, made a lot of sense then. It just doesn't work now.
You're basically saying that we all have these sort of like implicit contracts with one another.
That's right.
But how do we learn how to see them or identify them, or how do we know with conflict? So
any conflict.
How interesting. So the conflict that makes it
conflict and frustration.
Wow, that makes sense.
When you love somebody, you can't just leave them. You know, we live in a world that says if you're different from me, I have to colonize you and turn you into me. And if I can't colonize you, I have to kill you. And if I can't colonize you or kill you, I have to leave you. But when you're my child or my parent or my beloved, it's really hard to leave. And so the struggle becomes so much more intense. And we think that's just really good. It's something's trying to transform and change. And we're seeing more of it now than we've ever seen before. And it's also such a healing force.
A lot of this we think is kind of hardwired into human beings, right? We are built for relationships. We're built for attachment. And that's what makes the human species survive. And so it's kind of, we're doing the best we can, right? Because there's no instruction book really. And so we're trying to follow these impulses. And sometimes it becomes very conflictual, like a parent who is trying to decide what legacy to leave and how assets will be divided and what's going to happen after we're gone and all that kind of thing, that people attach to these different issues in different ways. But so you're going to attach to something or somebody. Maybe there's a few hermits that go around in living caves, but not many. Most of us attach to somebody or something. Some of us don't attach well to human beings, and so we attach to music or research or money or power or drugs or whatever it is, but we attach to something. And so what Wendy's talking about here is acknowledging these attachments, because very seldom do they change. See, that's the hard part, is we can't control somebody else's attachment. We would like to. It would make sense to us if I could just control the number of Amazon boxes that show up in my door. If I could just control that, everything would be okay. That's the story in my head, right? But when the power and control become an issue in a family or a business, that those attachments can be threatened or challenged.
And isn't that, Bob, does that not suggest that there is an automatic bias against someone who is conflict avoidant versus somebody who's conflict tolerant? Like, in other words, maybe bias is the wrong word. There's like a disadvantage, almost, somebody who's just backs away at all times from conflict and somebody who's just perfectly fine with it. How do you remedy that situation? Because invariably that conflict welcome is
if you define it as a growth opportunity, right? That it's in both parties' best interest that the one who runs away can learn to stand up and assert. And they won't do it like the other one does it. And so they often get judged and humiliated for it. But that's the direction that you're moving in. And the one who's very assertive or aggressive needs to ratchet it back as part of their growth. Wendy says, she has this cute thing she says about, it's either show up or shut up. Right? The one that runs away needs to start showing up. The one who's aggressive or assertive needs to shut up. And both need to learn to listen to the other. And that's where we apply these skills to relationship contracting that really help a lot. Because then we get to what the impulse or the intention really is.
Also, the part I would just add is that you can look at conflict, that schema you said of conflict avoidant or conflict. What was your word? Comfortable conflict?
Tolerance or whatever. Yeah.
Tolerance. And what we would say is that conflict is not where it should end up. Because the conflict tolerant person very seldom is saying, tell me was you think. The conflict tolerant person is good at arguing, good at debating, good at making a case. And so they like it because they have so much success there. And you're looking at adaptations. We think it's all about adaptations. So what we're saying is conflict is here. Everybody needs to find a different paradigm, a different skill set. And we talk about it as the bridge. You're over in your island, I'm in mine. We better figure out how we do this. And that communicating is one of the primary focus pieces in all family systems, in all systems, we think. But in the communication part, so much of what we've done in our culture, at least, is think about communicating is me being a better sender and more articulate, when it's actually probably the opposite. I need to figure out how to soothe myself enough to be a better listener and really know, who are you over there? Because what happens if you're really interested in who I am, my nervous system relaxes and gets at ease. And you really see it in the family structures that show up, because so often what do you look at are roles. Like we like to talk about birth order a lot because it's interesting to us. And I'm the youngest child, right? And so we have an ongoing, our whole relationship has been one in which that dynamic has played out. And if we have not successfully addressed it, we get in trouble. We see it with our kids. We see it in businesses. When we go in businesses, Bob does the Berkman exam, but he also does a lot about, and so who are the oldest children in the room and who are the middle children? And here's youngest children. And we have a lot of fun playing with the roles and stereotypes that they often carry, but they were functional once upon a time, reason and season.
And could you just elaborate on on birth order and what kind of mischief that usually creates, or what kind of opportunities that creates within families?
Well, I've been in business situations where transfer of power, money is happening, and that the oldest child in this situation was an already successful businessman, right? So he's got plenty of ideas and strong strengths about how to get these things done. And, the youngest kid just wants a check. I'm ready to go right off into the sunset. I just want to know what I'm going to get, right? And those two parts of what is it when you have two opposite sides?
Continuum?
Yeah, continuum. Thank you. That there's, as long as both of them are attached to the contract that they developed growing up, nothing positive is going to happen. But if the oldest child can say, I can see this may not agree with it, but I can understand why my brother would want to do what he wants to do. I don't want to do that. I don't know that it's good for him, but that I can appreciate and understand where that is coming from. Let's begin to talk about how we're going to work together. One of the companies I've been working with is that these people are so smart. I mean, they're just amazing. And they get in the same room, but they all have opinions about this or that. And so we start working together. And so I just asked each one of them to take 2 or 3 minutes and share what it was like for them growing up. And that changed everything about, them understanding each other at a very different level so that their contracts could be a lot more in depth and strong, because one of them grew up in a military family and dad was the boss and everything rolled down here. The other one grew up in Louisiana, had no father figure in his life and just had to do things on his own, right? So you could see how that the high structure one could not tolerate the one who was just, had to live day by day. So that kind of thing can just kind of free up some understanding and energy.
Create some compassion.
Yeah, create some compassion and you know where this person's coming from so that you know who you're dealing with when you contract. Because contracts happen all the time, and they are often broken.
Uh-huh.
And we think that the reason they're broken is because they weren't really based on that commitment to the other, to each other, that they understood where this person was coming from and what it meant to them, what they wanted, or try to reach, the best outcome for the family as you can.
As you could, yeah.
I mean, if everybody's agreeing that what we want is the best outcome for the family, so interesting to get people to talk about what they want for someone as opposed to what they want from someone.
That's good.
Right? And you hear the older brother, what is it that you want for your brother? And let's not talk about what you're trying to get from him, but what you want for him and what that brother wants for you. They get to some pretty deep stuff.
Yeah.
Wow. Great.
And then the contract, I think, means something.
Yeah.
And it is, because the problem with contracts, if they're non-conscious, they're rigid, right? There's no flexibility in them. And so that's what makes it difficult to make a deal.
Yeah.
And to make, because see, then your contract is just based on incentives and pressures. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? If there's no real heart-to-heart commitment there, then it's all about reward and punishment.
Do you think about monogamy as one of the most important implicit contracts, or maybe in that case explicit? Can you talk about what do you see in families when maybe people have different opinions or different desires in that regard? I mean, that could be a very difficult thing for a couple to navigate.
Monogamy can be is often a very difficult thing, especially for the couples that are in their 40s, 50s maybe. They begin to say, hey, that needs to shift. It's also who's right, who knows what's the best thing and how it should be in terms of what that looks like. Back to Mo's thing about the birth order, like as an oldest child, I tend to think I know what's right and what should happen. And I'm just trying to help him. And as this youngest child, he comes along and says, you're not the boss of me. And that struggle shows up intensely when you're really looking at things like a sexual contract in a relationship. What's the best way for this to be? We will do best if we are in a monogamous relationship. And I think when couples get married and come together, it doesn't seem as much of an issue because they're so infatuated with each other and they're so involved with each other. You can really only be infatuated with one person at a time. You can love more than one person at a time. But infatuation is a whole chemical, hormonal thing. And it fades over time. So the idea of, wait a minute, there's more I could be and know and have, and we should spread our wings and we should change our marital contract. And most of the time what we bump up against could be that because of edge we're at in terms of we get the people who are really struggling. Because you'll often find one person's wishing to have a more open marriage and the other person really isn't. And so that's a perfect example, Sylvia, of that business about going from an unconscious contract to a conscious agreement contract. And we also think that divorce is a completion of a contract. We're not people that walk around saying divorce is a terrible, awful thing. Can be. The way it's often handled is the huge problem because of the prisoners it takes in children. Contracts get completed. You'll see a spike in the divorce rate, for instance, at certain very predictable family structured times, like when the youngest children goes away for college. You'll see a big tension because my role is now shifting. And I think that's where a lot of the monogamy piece comes in big time, is aliveness, because we all want to feel. We have this dilemma of I want to feel safe and I want to feel alive and joyful. And safe means usually low risk, keep it the way it's been, hold tight. Alive and joyful is often take risks, try some things, see what's out there. And so you have that, the dichotomy, but they both matter. You can't thrive without both.
Right. And could we maybe, and Bob talked about the situation where there's a succession challenge, inheritance. So could we maybe touch on the contractual or relational complexities of affluent families where it's not just, the risk is not just emotional, the risk is also financial. And to what extent does that change relational contracting? To what extent? Yeah. So maybe if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, it surfaced for us, first of all, way back when we were dealing with the runaway teenagers, because so often what you were looking at in the late 60s and early 70s was adolescents who were saying, I don't want your money. I don't want your prestige. I want to create my own life. And the parent coming back with, well, you won't get any of what you should have gotten if you don't. So that whole struggle surfaced for us a lot way back when, because there was so much of a, I don't care, I'm going to get rid of it. But of course, as time has evolved, it becomes clearer and clearer that, I want to feel cared for. And often in the succession planning, cared for is through money and power. And I will feel more cared for if I have more money and power. And I should give the money and power to the most competent, or like we've got a family right now I'm working with, and the parents want to leave a great deal of the money to the weakest link in the family, the adult child who has never really been able to get a job and never really, but who's going to take care of him? And so we have to make sure we create wealth management that takes care of him first and foremost. And then his siblings are furious about this, about the inequity. So that whole business of why people do what they do with succession planning and what they want for the people they're planning for, when Bob says it's what you want from and for, it's related to all of that, is what would you like this to look like? And we had when we first got into Imago, part of what we had such fun with was talking to one of our founders in Imago, who's Helen LaKelly Hunt. And Helen and Harville are a married couple and very good friends of ours for 40 years. And what got clear is that Helen was living out of a long legacy of how do you handle all of that wealth that has come through her family with her father's amazing successes. But, he hadn't been a rich man. HL was not rich until he won the oil well in the poker game. But the children grew up with so much wealth and so much responsibility. And part of what Helen was bringing to the table for Imago was, what do you do when there's such a hierarchical position about how you're supposed to do this, but that doesn't necessarily take into account, for example, the differences between the cultures thinking about men and women. Shouldn't all the prestige, the power, the importance go to the men? Why should that not be the way it is? And so that shifting place of figuring out, how do you look at this and say, what is wealth for? What does it do? How is it supposed to play out? And a lot of what Bob, I think, talks a ton about is unintended consequences. The part of what we were just saying, David Brooks's idea about stupid, if you don't think ahead to what's coming, you're living in the land of stupid. And I think that's a big part of where we think happens, is that those decisions should be made in community experience. Doesn't mean that the kids get to decide, but they should have a voice. And if they don't, you'll pay for it later.
So I'd like to make a couple of points, and then I'd like it if you would talk about CPR.
Oh.
That work for you? Karen.
Being me.
The coordination, I love it. The logistics and choreography of this is brilliant.
Okay. So what Harville has said that really has made an impact on me, Harville and Helen, is that we have these three basic needs that we ought to keep in mind when we're doing contracting. One of them is that all of us want to be heard. We want our story on the table, and we want to be listened to at a deep level. We want to be seen. We want to be visible in a relationship, to be acknowledged and seen and valued, right? So that we matter in these contracting situations. And so if we can try to keep those in mind, that everybody's got those. You may not like, or you can't control what this person is attaching to, and that's too bad, but they still have those same three impulses and needs that they have. And so that's what we want to help facilitate with families, is that everybody, most of the time, can feel like they've had their say, they feel seen, and they feel valued within that system. There are some problems that are unsolvable. There are some family dynamics that are not going to get better. And I try to keep my humility about me when I'm doing that work, because sometimes my best efforts are not going to work because the contracts are so rigid and the pattern of behavior is so repetitive, it's not going to change. We just, we want to call that when we see it, and support people in being somewhat less attached to what they think is so important to them.
Bob, what are some of the telltale signs of that irreconcilable dynamic?
Yeah. Or what?
Same
Like
conversation.
What makes it
conversation? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Also, on the tail of that, why do some people change more rapidly?
That's a good question.
I think because they have to. The choice of not.
I think they change because it's interesting and enlivening. I think it's around the rigidity. If you think about mindset science, what we've learned, and we were looking at the ideas around the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. And the fixed mindset has had a real purpose, right? It really creates some security and some stability. And if it can't become more of a growth mindset, then you end up with can't fit into who we were any longer. And those are where we consider irreconcilable differences. What we think, though, actually, is that irreconcilable differences, which was the grounds for divorce. And if you say the differences are a given, what makes them irreconcilable is the terror of really hearing that you're different from me. And me figuring out, could I be with you if you're that different from me? And if we don't do that as in the world, I think we'll perish. I mean, we have to figure out how the differences aren't so terrifying to us. And actually, that's the between. That's why we think it's the both and. But we haven't grown up in a world where people lived that way. And we have to change or we're going to.
Like you're saying, heal the family to heal the world.
We think so. Actually think that is the tipping point is coming, but we think it's going to be through committed relationships, important relationships, those changing and shifting and becoming conscious and having intentional live will actually be the thing that, almost all of the corporate business stuff that we do comes out of somebody who came to one of us for marriage therapy or brought their kid in and said, this makes sense over here. And having a structure, a lot of what Imago work looked like initially was good communication structure. Flow, sender, receiver, back and forth, both and, mirror me, validate my perspective, have some empathy for where I am before you tell me what's wrong with what I'm saying. It's like flow.
Right. And just to come back to that growth mindset, one of the things that we were actually talking about it this morning, how do you deal with a growth mindset dynamic when one party adopts a moral superiority where I am right and you are wrong and I am more ethical and I am more honest and whatever that is?
Yeah. That's a frightened person. That's a very frightened person. I think that kind of rigidity, I'm holding on to it desperately because I don't know how to survive if I'm not right. And I don't know how to survive if the moral code I live under isn't everybody's moral code. And so I think the fear is where we have to go in and say, I know you're afraid, but there is another way you can look at this. which is this is someone you deeply care about, somebody you could actually. I watched Driving Miss Daisy on the movie channel on the airplane and got so tickled about that original that early thinking about the both and. So we think of it as fear. But if you cannot come out of that superior I'm right, you can assume that person's not going to have quality relationships. They're just not going to happen. They'll be episodic. I'll be with you, especially if you've got money. I'll be with you for a while, but sooner or later, I'm going to want to have a voice. And if you can't make room for my voice, then we're going to have power struggle. But all power struggles are trying to become growth struggles.
That's a good quote for this podcast. All power struggles are growth struggles.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
I think of it as growth trying to happen. And we're talking about this as if it's easy, and it's not. Right? The most profound personal work that I've had to do is because of my relationship with Wendy.
Right.
Because we are in some ways very different. And we look at it's amazing, that thing about you can look at the same event and interpret it drastically differently because of your own thought processes and filters that we all have. And so when we go into this contracting area, Wendy and I go with a lot of humility and a lot of listening, because if that doesn't happen, then there's no vulnerability. And if the vulnerability doesn't happen, there's no connection.
Right.
Well, I exaggerated there. There might be some connection, but it's not as deep as it could be.
In your relationship, there's interesting thing is, yes, there could be power struggles, but it's coming from a point of equality. If we think about the example we used earlier, where there may be power gradients, where my father or mother is also my boss, or the one that determines what my lifestyle will be based on what they write into the will or the trust or whatever, how are those reconcilable in terms of getting to vulnerability? Any thoughts on those dynamics?
Great question.
Usually it's the foundation of it is common ground, right? What both want for each other. It's so complicated for a adult son or daughter to work for, be accountable to, and be directed by a parent. I mean, that is, you can say it's an accident looking for a place to happen, right?
Okay.
Because it is just, so those kind of relationships really can be helped by having a third party in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happening more and more, which is an exciting thing. But I think the question he keeps raising around, if it's possible to say to the patriarch, for instance, what do you want for your child? Not from her, but for her. And to the child, what do you want for your dad? What do you want for him? And that begins to shift it to the place you can then look for some common ground about what's in the mix about it. But cutoffs in families are tragic, and they are generational. And we think that part of what we do a lot of is just acknowledge these things. You could do this, or you could do this, or what we think is what's in the Talmud that says if there's only two paths, you have to take the third. You have to find another way. And you could, believing that people could find bigger life, could find more ways, is possible, is really helping. And there's more and more research being done about healthy relationships and the elements that have them. And so we can do more quoting. We talk a lot about brain function and about the unconscious brain versus the conscious brain and how wired in it is, and that you can change the wiring system. And isn't that an amazing thing? So science is really on our side about all of this. I think that if you look into deep dives in most religions, there's places always in there about the both and. It's just that we don't live that way yet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. It's beautiful. Have you ever had any examples of working with a couple where there was a large power differential because of different strata of wealth? Do you have any tips for our audience about how it's possible to work through that kind of power imbalance?
Yeah, those are more and more frequent. And I think that has a lot to do with couples marrying often at later ages. A lot of what we talk about are prenups and postnups. And the prenup idea is really, came out of the concept of when one person has a whole lot of resources and another doesn't. How are you going to go into this marriage? And inevitably, most of the couples hate to talk about prenups. They're painful, they're sad, they're scary. And some of what I believe is it doesn't have to be that way. It could be that we are trying to do our very best to think ahead, plan ahead, protect, but respect and hear what's happening. And if you don't do that kind of thinking, inevitably, you can pretty much guarantee. I've had several couples where it'll come along and the prenup, we don't need a prenup. Oh, we have to, okay, last minute, we'll sign the prenup. And then, 3 to 5 years later, you've got a huge rupture and resentment has been building for years. So being able to predict that and say, let me give you some thoughts about how this could go and what it's likely to go and thinking ahead. So if you do a fast prenup, for example, what are the chances that that's going to work? And who are you trying to protect in the prenup? And what are you trying to protect? And why are you trying to protect it? Those become very precious, important questions that can. I had one couple where finally she was so furious that he was going to insist on a prenup and couldn't get through it until he laid out how complicated his parent structure was. His parents and his grandparents had legacy money, and they were desperately frightened to do anything other than protect that wealth because it was old country wealth. And when she could hear that and say, wait a minute, this is in part to help your parents and your grandparents relax. It's got a different, it's just there's more to the picture that goes down with it. But it's a power differential that has to be addressed.
Right. Could you comment on the postnups?
Well, I like postnups because a lot of times what happens, I think, for us is we see couples who are in crisis because the wheels fell off and they want to put the wheels back on, but they don't know for sure how to put the wheels back on. And one of my favorite stories was a couple we worked with 30 years ago. And they got into the place where she was saying, I'm done. You're not the boss of me anymore. This is not going to work. We're going to get divorced. He didn't want to get divorced. She didn't really either, but it was so different. So they worked in therapy. And the conclusion was he ended up writing $1 million check and putting it in a checking account in her name. And that was essentially the postnup. It would stay there in the case that, and I mean, they never touched it. It went, but just the idea that he was willing to actually give that much wealth to her as a statement of commitment and respect. And money is power, in these couples. So I think the postnup idea of, well, if you were going to stay together, what would you need to know? Because by the time the conflict has hit, people are really frightened about their futures. I thought we were forever and we're not.
And so one interesting thing about these conversations as we were talking, first of all, I love your paradigm of, what do you want for this person versus from this person? And in the example of the father for the son for the father, I think it's such a beautiful concept. Obviously, the difference between spousal dynamics and then some of those vertical parent-child dynamics or sibling dynamics is unfortunately you can't get rid of the other, right? And so in a spousal scenario, somebody is a narcissist, you could get out of Dodge. If your child is a narcissist, you can't get out of Dodge. So how do you think about what I want for you when the narcissistic kid or the selfish, immature, spoiled brat, whatever it is, he isn't even thinking about something for the other party. How does that
I think it's
come
where
together?
contracts come in so beautifully, Mo. I think that's exactly where that comes in. You know, that a legacy process, a will, foundations are contractual and often set up, I think, in ways to say, I'm going to control how the wealth, like one family she said, you won't get any money from me if you don't all agree to get better at communicating. And I'm going to be the one who says what better communication looks like. It's that I'm using my power to try to make something happen that could be a positive thing. But I think often you're looking at the consequence of, if you've got this kid, you know, drugs and alcohol are the place where this probably surfaces the most terrifyingly in terms of can't get equal money because my son is an addict. Oh, I can't give everybody the same amount of money. So now what am I going to do? And that's often where I think the whole family system has to get involved. And we do a lot of 3-generational family work, and often that's what it's about.
And I mean, this is it's not easy stuff. I mean, this is something that Wendy and I have struggled with personally, right? And because Wendy has this proposal, well, let's just divide up the money and give it to them now. Let's don't wait till we're dead. Let's just give it to them now. And they said, well, what's going to happen if they spend all that money and then we're at the end of our lives and they have no money and we have no money? Wendy kind of says, well, that's the decision that they make. And, you know, that's maybe they'll learn something from that or whatever. You know, often we don't have a right answer. What we're looking for is kind of a bridge, because again, some of these problems are not going away. That child is narcissistic. That's not going to change. Or the family system is so rigidified that it's not going to change. And so we kind of say, okay, so what is our contract going forward?
And for now, we're big on time limits. Let's re-examine this a year from now. Let's re-examine this when this person is this age. We can be flexible if we think about it more consciously, like in business.
And just that word consciously, okay? That in itself connotes awareness.
That's right. Intention and impact match.
Right? So how, in the absence of, you know, obviously naturally as families are working with you, you could kind of prod that awareness. In the absence of a couple or a family having the benefit of working with you, how do they reveal that consciousness? How do they let that consciousness come forward?
I think it's conflict again.
Like I had to say conflict.
We started.
Yeah, we asked this question. I was like, I know the answer. It's conflict. Learn that in this episode. You know, it's conflict.
I mean, you know, it's got energy in it. I've got a family right now where he's got a lot of money and he's married a young woman, and his adult children are furious because his will is going to take care of her first because he feels like that's his obligation. Now, does that make sense? To him, it makes perfect sense. Does it make sense to the adult children? Heck no, right? Unless you start to broaden out with what would they like to see happen in their lives and what would they feel about their spouses. And so it's that common ground kind of place that would say, there's a lot of conversation. I'm working with them because he made these decisions, and the adult children say,
right. And often you'll see the strengths of a family that built that wealth be what is getting in the way of a new contract.
Talk about that.
Because what I did to generate all this wealth was be structured, be organized, not take any bullshit, and I built a very powerful business. And then you do that with your family and see how well it works.
Yeah.
And the conflict is up.
It's actually an interesting dynamic because we see this in the world of when people move from the world of wealth creation and they move to the world of wealth preservation. They typically, make money like a pro and manage it like an amateur.
Well, that's so good. Yes.
And it's a completely different discipline. All the more so when you're dealing with authoritative sort of corporate dynamics. And then when you're dealing with, sort of vulnerable intimacy dynamics, like those are, again, different paradigms.
Well, sometimes, I mean, this is not always the best thing to do, but I have said, and you want to do this? Why?
Yeah.
You sure you want to marry this? I mean, you sure you want to do this? Because this is, right now it may look like, a great relationship, but my job is to think about what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years. When your biological children have children and they want to know what's in it for their children, and all that stuff begins to play out, and it can just be really, really hard.
What would you say if you had one of your clients come to you and say, look, I'm engaged to this woman, I love her, she's amazing, but she just got diagnosed as bipolar. What should I do? Like, how would you advise in a moment like that?
He did this recently. I heard him.
Well, this seems like a big commitment. Maybe we should talk about it.
And I think you can do things like, you could say what do you know about this person you want to be with?
Good. I like that.
And based on what you know, what do you think you need to know about yourself in order to be with this person? Because there are many folks out there, and often I think they're usually very well resourced, who like to help. They like to take care of. That someone's bipolar diagnostics may be a little scary, but I probably can help her. I can probably make a big difference in her life. And he may be absolutely right that he could. Because if you think about so many of the diagnostics come out of wounding. And so somebody wants to be there to help the wounding.
Right.
And we would say, there's a good chance you could. The problem is you're not addressing your own vulnerabilities. And you're making it a one-way street, and sooner or later, that may be problematic. But when you have older men particularly who like to marry much younger women, right? And they see themselves, saving, helping. And in some ways they are, there's nothing off about that. But it's like, and what do you want? And what does the younger woman want for you? And things like the diagnostics can really fit into, well, what are you going to ask her about what she's going to do for you?
The other thing I would do, Sylvia, is advise, start setting limits.
Yeah.
And see what happens. Start saying things that are, protecting you or taking care of yourself, and just see what happens. And if you get a response and say, oh, that makes sense. I can see where you're coming from. Or, who the hell do you think you are? That, becomes big uproar. Then at least they have that experience before making a more permanent commitment.
Yeah.
Choices.
It's almost like we used to say, have your fights in advance. Wait till you're in a committed relationship to fight.
Yeah.
Because then it's too late.
Yeah. And we're big pushers about repair. We think repair is a really essential skill set in all committed relationships. So a lot of it is, let's get you putting the wheels back on and figuring out how you can do good wheel repair. And if you can do good wheel repair, diagnostics don't matter nearly as much.
Right.
I've read that repair is where really all of the deep attachment actually happens.
I like that. I think it's true. So we teach it a lot. It's a core issue.
My guess is that happens through vulnerability. The repair does.
Good.
That I did something that hurt you, and I acknowledge that I did that, and I'm working on not doing it again. I wish I hadn't done that to you, and I don't want to hurt you that way anymore. That kind of thing, where someone's really kind of coming to table with good repair.
Right. When you think about, again, as in your work with affluent families or intergenerational family dynamics, what are the most common blind spots that you see families coming in with?
I know what's good for you. Why can't you see it?
This is where Bob was talking earlier that we came up with it's just overly simplistic, but that if there's a struggle, we think that it is a communication problem. It's a problem around people feeling cared about. It's a problem around use of power. It's a problem around responsibility. So we think if you look at it and say you're in struggle, how are you communicating? Can we get you good at this? Do you feel cared about? What helps you feel cared about? How do you express care? What does care look like in your family now, today? Who's got responsibility for what? And can that begin to experiment and shift? And who's wielding the power? And, hierarchical power is a reality. We don't ever think that's going to go away. But one of the courses Bob teaches is called positive power and influence, to say, if you have this kind of power, I'm in charge, I'm the one with the money, I'm the parent, right? Okay. That ain't going to change. So how do I do that in a positive way that keeps relationship flowing? Because without those four things, you have problems.
That's referring to the CCPR, right? Communication, caring, power, and responsibility. As kind of the cornerstone of for relationships.
Is that based on your work, or is that part of? Yeah, that's based on your work.
Based on our work. The good old teenagers who ran away from home in the 60s taught us that.
It would be great if we could link something in the show notes, if you have anything written about that we could share with our listeners if they want to go a little bit more deeper.
Okay, I think I have a handout.
Okay, that would be great. And just maybe, as we're sort of coming towards the end here, I asked you about common mistakes. Are there common disciplines, either best practices, habits, things that you strongly recommend for people to implement daily, weekly, with some regular cadence that help them perhaps address their CCPR, foundation?
Well, I'll add a little spin on that, because my closing question was going to be, can you give us, since we were going to publish this for Valentine's Day, can you give us your top, 3 to 5 tips for how to make, our relationships with our significant others just a little bit better this Valentine's Day?
Some of the best research we have on really masterful, successful relationships is you should have a 20-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions with your beloved every day. 20-to-1. Smiles.
It's a high bar.
The master couples, that's what they have. Even on their worst days, it's 5-to-1. This is great research that came out of John Gottman's work many years ago. So every day, putting positives in. And when we made the shift about this, we had an interesting experience about, like I'd walk in the room and I'd touch him, or I'd smile at him because I was trying to get to the 20. And we had friends who would go, you guys are so sweet. It's like we'd changed so much that we looked a little fakey and a little, but I walk in the kitchen now, and if he's unloaded the dishwasher, I say, thanks for unloading the dishwasher. And in many of our couples, they go, well, you shouldn't have to say thank you for that. That's just a job, but why not? So 20-to-1 ratio, positive to negatives. We think the second tip that's such a big, important one is take out being funny or sarcastic or anything at the other person's expense. Don't ever make your other person less than.
Yeah, especially if you think what you are saying is particularly insightful or funny, you should just keep your mouth shut.
No, thank you. Because as soon as I make you less than me, I've just done this, right? So that was a hard one for us to shift, because we both grew up out west with lots of sarcasm and put downs and thought that was love, right? And, the people that put us down did love us. Poke, 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 poke. But it doesn't feed soul. It doesn't help you flourish with that. And the good repair. Think about where you've made a good repair. We like very much those three as the top ones. The frame that Harville and Helen have come up with is zero negativity. Get rid of the negativity. It does nothing for you. All negativity is a protest. It's the extension of the infant cry, is what we say. So when you were little, if you were hungry or scared or sad, you cried and somebody picked you up. So the learning was, if I make you miserable enough, you'll pick me up and feed me. So we think that criticism is still that. I'm just trying to poke at you to get you to be good to me. Good luck on that one. So those are probably time, attention. We're both always talking a lot about how do you self-regulate and then co-regulate. My nervous system together. This is why meditation and breath patterns and playfulness and fun makes such a difference.
Wow. So you've been at this for 40 years.
50.
50. Oh, sorry, I misheard.
Well,
I figured
40
years. You must be 40 years. So, but
we don't have to.
we don't have to do that. But okay, it's been decades working together, married together. What are you still working on that all those decades have yet to?
Apologies. He does something that upsets me, and I want him to look at me and say, I'm so sorry. And he wants to go out and fix it. And then when he fixes it, he wants me to notice that he fixed it. And I'm going, I could use the I'm sorry. And for him, I'm sorry.
Yep. I'm sorry didn't mean a lot to me. I want to know, are you taking care of what you did?
That's what we're working on.
Words are cheap. I get it. Except for some.
So we're all works in progress. We're not trying to pretend that we've got all the answers. Our value is on connection between human beings. Mm-hmm. So that's what we try to do. You know, a lot of times people can figure out what they need to do for themselves. Now, I think I have great ideas. I think Wendy has great ideas. But what is most important usually is the ideas that the family has, or the family or those people who want to connect. Those are the people who have the best ideas.
And acknowledging that, we're going to be 75 this year, both of us. And 75 is really different than 55. It doesn't feel that different, but it's also, can we figure out what do we need to do differently as how we think about ourselves, each other, the relationship? I do want you to hold my hand when I'm walking down the stairs. Thank you very much. It's like, it's a different era. So seasons again.
That's beautiful.
Okay,
we've been fun.
This has been amazing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's fun to talk about it. I think what you're doing is really important. Really important.
Yeah.
Let me tell you one quick story.
Yeah,
so
please.
Imago is now in Liberia, and safe conversations is the term we use at this simple level. The president of Liberia is fascinated with dialogue, and he's now asking his government to be dialogical. And Liberia is a country where there was so much trauma and abuse. And the people that are taking it in there, which is all the Imago work and the safe conversations, are changing the culture. That would be like if whole countries did this, became dialogical instead of monological.
Wow.
So thanks for asking us.
Yeah, thank you. Let's hope we can have some of that between Canada and the U.S.
Yeah.
To express my gratefulness too for you honoring us by inviting us to share. And, it's just been very enjoyable, and, thank you very much.
Yeah. No, thank you. You're the insight, the wisdom. I have no doubt this will help a lot of people, and certainly give a lot of food for thought to our families. And I do think that your work is God's work, and we appreciate all that you do, not just for this, but all that you've done for all those years. And if at 75, I could do half of what you guys are capable of, I would feel blessed many times over.
Thanks.
Really, thank you. And we'll put also in the show notes a link to any workshops that you have in the future, so that families want to learn more, they can do.
Before we go, there are some great tips, relationship tips on our website.
Great. Thank you.
And we'll direct folks there. Guys, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your vacation. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And really appreciate you.
Night.
Good night.
Have a great evening.
That was a great conversation. I don't know what you think, Mo, but that inspired me to remember that truly the family is the center of society. If we have healthy families, we have healthy communities, we have healthy businesses. And so it's a really great reminder of the importance of communication in all of our relationships, both personal and business.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there were just so many great tidbits and insights and frameworks. This is one that I'll have to listen to several times. And just as we wrap, I just want to remind all our listeners that, again, we're hoping to make a dent in the world of mental health through this effort. And so if you're able to support our mission, please click on the description below to donate. Every contribution makes a difference, and we appreciate your support. Have a great day, and until next time.